Chapter 19. Empires in Collision. Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, 1800 to 1914. Section 1. Reversal of Fortune. China's Century of Crisis. Let's first examine this picture here. What does this political cartoon show? Which nations are represented here? These are all some questions that you should be thinking about as you're examining this picture. Looks like this image represents the European and Japanese power struggle over China. As you can see, China is represented as a pie. They're carving up a pie there on the table. On the left is the British Queen, Queen Victoria. Next to her is the German Kaiser Wilhelm II. And next to him is Tsar Nicholas II from Russia. And of course, rounding up the last part of the table is the Meiji Emperor of Japan sitting next to him. Now the female that's standing behind Tsar Nicholas II is representing France. And behind the entire group stands a man in Chinese dress and hair, and he's got his hands up in protest. Now, which nations are depicted in a demeaning way? They don't look very good, and maybe which are the most favorable? And I think we should think about why. Now, of the Europeans, Queen Victoria here, and the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, it looks like are drawn in the least flattering way. The Japanese emperor, he looks kind of dark and brooding, maybe even troubled. While the Russian Tsar, he looks handsome, cool, calm, collected, and the woman back here representing France is supposed to be depicted as very beautiful and just, standing back watching everything happen. Now the artist was French and decided not to implicate his own country in this, power grab, but instead he idolized his nation and feminine beauty, even though the French did participate in the struggle for territory in China. But there was a French alliance with Russia, which would indicate why these two are connected, and why, as the artist being French, why these two look the most favorable, if you will. And that probably prompted him to draw them more generously. But out of all of them, I think the least flattering would be the depiction of the Chinese man with his hands up that, even resemble claws with those nails. And his facial features almost appear demonic. So what role does the Chinese figure in the background play? Well, despite the artist's demeaning characterization of the Chinese man, he stressed the unfair exclusion from the imperial rivalry over China. Right? They're being excluded, and they're actually fighting over his country. Now, these other nations came together to decide the fate of China amongst themselves, and the people there are seemingly hopeless, maybe unable to do anything about it. Okay. The Opium War of 1839 to 1842 in China continues to resonate emotionally with many Chinese. Britain's violent intrusion and sale of addictive opium to the Chinese people still really affects them today. And many Chinese still describe this as a century of humiliation. And most of the peoples of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and even Latin America dealt with, in some way, an intrusion of European imperialism. So we'll focus on societies that faced internal crises while maintaining a formal independence. And there are four main dimensions of European imperialism that confronted these societies. the military might and political ambitions of rival European states, the involvement in a New World economy that radiated from Europe, influence of traditional European culture like language and religion and literature, engagement with the culture of modernity. And at the same time, they had to deal with, like I said, internal pressures as well. In 1793, the Chinese Emperor Qianlong rebuffed the British request that China rescind or loosen their restrictions on trade. The Chinese authorities had controlled and limited European activities for centuries. But by 1912, the Chinese Empire had collapsed, and it became very weak in this new European-dominated world. All right, the crisis within. China, well, to a large degree, was really a victim of its own success. The population had grown from approximately 100 million in 1685 to approximately 430 million in 1853. And China didn't really have an accompanying industrial revolution during this time. And so that put a lot of pressure on the land to keep up with feeding the people. And because of the lack of an industrial revolution and technological development, the result was a vast majority of people were impoverished and starvation. And the Chinese bureaucracy did not keep pace with this growing population. The central state slowly lost control of the provincial officials and gentry. The corruption and the harsh treatment of peasants among officials was really a pandemic. And there were a lot of bandit gangs and peasant rebellions that actually became common. Okay, the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Uprising or Taiping Rebellion is really a culmination of China's internal crisis. Affected a large portion of China from 1850 to 1864. And their leader claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus. He said that he was sent to establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. He called for radical equality and even planned to industrialize China. But the attitude towards women was also revolutionary. Women fought in their own regiments. They ordered the feet of women to be unbound. The land program promised men and women equal shares of the land. Women could sit civil service exams and actually take up positions that traditionally had oversaw women, but now they could hold those positions. Marriage more and more became accepted by mutual attraction, but this wasn't exactly universal. A leader was a little bit more conservative in his views. Now, the initial successes led to the establishment of the capital in Nanjing in 1853. But ultimately, the rebellion was crushed by 1864. Now, the resolution of the Taiping Rebellion actually consolidated the power of the provincial gentry even more. The result was this intense conservatism conservatism. There we go. So China's problems actually weren't resolved. And the massive civil war had seriously weakened the Chinese economy. And that's because about 20 to 30 million people had died. All right, the Opium Wars. Western pressures. The Opium Wars really show the transformation of China's relationship with Europe. Opium had been used actually on a small scale in China for centuries, but the British began to sell it in large quantities, and they used Indian opium and sold that in China. Now, the Chinese authorities recognized the dangers of opium addiction, and they actually tried to stop the trade, but didn't try really hard. And the European merchants were able to bribe officials to smuggle that opium in. And so China suffered a specie or money drain from the large quantities of silver that was spent on that opium. In 1836, the emperor finally decided to put forth more effort and funding to really suppress the trade. Of course, the British had a response to that. They responded with the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. And it forced the Chinese to accept free trade and quote-unquote proper relations among the different countries. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842. And then the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1858. The Europeans vandalized the Imperial Summer Palace. They forced the Chinese to open more treaty ports to foreigners. China was even open to foreign missionaries. And those Western powers were actually given the right to patrol some of China's interior waterways. And China was also defeated by the French in 1885 and the Japanese in 1895. And so the Qing dynasty was deeply weakened by all of these losses at a time when China really needed a strong government to deal with modernization and these new developments. But there were a lot of unequal treaties that inhibited China's industrialization. So it's like a vicious cycle that they couldn't get out of. Alright, the failure of conservative modernization. Now, the Chinese government tried to act and solve these problems. They developed the policy of self-strengthening in the 1860s and 1870s. There's the application of traditional principles along with some very limited borrowing from the West. They made efforts to improve the examination system and even restore some of the rural social and economic order. There was a foundation of a few industrial factories, and they actually established some modern arsenals and shipyards, and even began to study some other languages and sciences. Now, the conservative leaders feared that this development would harm the landowning class. And that even led to the Boxer Rebellion, or the Boxer Uprising, in 1898 that lasted to 1901. There were militia organizations that killed many Europeans and Chinese Christians. They even besieged the foreign embassies in Beijing. So the Western powers in Japan occupied Beijing to try and crush the revolt. And they imposed massive reparation payments on China. And so a growing number of educated Chinese became rather disillusioned with the Qing dynasty. They were not happy. They developed organizations to really examine the situation and try and come up with some effective reforms. And there was this growing drive for a truly unified nation in which more people could actually take part in public life. And this Chinese nationalism was against both foreign imperialists and the foreign Qing dynasty. And actually, the government agreed to some of the reforms in the early 20th century, but it wasn't enough, and the imperial order collapsed in 1911. And here's a map that shows you the Taiping Uprising, the Neon Rebellion, which is up there in the northern part, and the Boxer Rebellion, even a little bit further north than that. And you can see even some Muslim revolts. This is in this is where I'm looking right up here, during the mid-1800s. And then this bigger map shows you some of the European colonies and Japanese colonies, the areas of land that they were able to take, and even where foreign countries were heavily influential and even controlled parts of China. The Japanese, the Russians, the British, the French, and even German. Okay, and here is a picture. It's a pretty neat picture here. Thought I'd add this in. And that is Chapter 19, Section 1. The Reversal of Fortune, China's Century of Crisis.